Hi everyone, Ron from Combat Arts Institute of Australia here. In the previous video, I talked a little bit about the recent discussion, feud between Krav Maga expert Ryan Hoover and the Gracie family of BJJ notoriety. And some of the thoughts that I have on that discussion, I didn't really say who I think is right or wrong, but what I did discuss was the assumptions that we need to make while we are training for self-defense. And those in themselves dictate the types of techniques and things that we can and can't do. Okay. And one of the key things I'll highlight there, just because I just used the word technique, is that technique is incidental, right? So I think it's more important to train principles. Obviously, you need to know techniques and body mechanics and stuff like that. But we want to train from a base of principles, not just techniques. So we talked about all the assumptions that I think are relevant for self-defense training. Multiple attackers, no rules, weapons, taking the environment into consideration, taking the legal framework into consideration, looking at surprise attacks, looking at luck, looking at de-escalation, de-escalation and verbal judo, and awareness, and mobility, close range, a whole bunch of stuff, okay? And you can watch the other video if you're not sure what I'm talking about. What I wanted to talk about today is kind of where that leads. So we looked at the assumptions that we want to make. Now let's look at how we need to train based on those assumptions. And again, I'm not talking about techniques today. I'm talking about principles that we want to apply when we are training for self-defense specifically. Okay? So the first thing I think we need to include when we're looking at training for self-defense is range and skill set. What I mean by that is we need to be familiar with fighting at different fighting ranges and with different skill sets. In other words, from weapon range to kicking range to punching range to clinch range to the ground, as well as integrating those as seamlessly as possible. Some people hear this and might go, well, yeah, MMA is pretty much self-defense. Well, not quite, okay, because MMA is still a competition. It ignores a lot of other things that are very important. But they do get a lot of things right in the context that at least they train those skill sets, weapons excluded. Okay. Now, usually when I say that, people freak out a little bit because they go, hold on a second. If I need to be good on the ground and standing up and punching and kicking and in the clinch and using weapons, that's going to take me like 20 years to get really good. Well, to get really, 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 really good, maybe yes. But the idea is not to have a black belt in 4 or 5 different styles. The idea is to have enough of a familiarity with every situation you might find yourself in that at least you never get stuck going, I've never been here, I don't know what to do. Okay, so there's a lot of skill sets that you want to improve. It also does not mean that you can't have a favorite. I train with some guys who are phenomenal boxers and with tons of self-defense experience, and guess what? Their go-to is always, kind of like sidestep, hit the guy with a straight right. And they'll drop like 95 people out of 100. They're that good, right? I train with another amazing Krav Maga practitioner who is also a phenomenal judoka and jiu-jitsu expert. So for him, while he's got competency in a lot of skill sets, everything is about closing in and getting hold of the guy. Because once he clinches with you, you're screwed. I've trained with other guys where everything was get in and work gouges and tears, eyes and throat, everything, and they works for them all the time. Trained with another guy where everything was hammer fists, and he was phenomenal as well. I trained with a wrestling phenom who can do stuff in the self-defense context using wrestling skills that I can't dream of doing. All these guys have a preference, guys and girl, I should say, that wrestler is a woman. They all have a preference, but what they all understand is that they need to train a little bit of everything. So they can all throw punches, they can all use weapons, they can all wrestle, they can all fight on the ground. They have a preferred skill set, which they'll, try and work towards, but they can do a little bit of everything. Okay, so you can have a favorite. You don't have to be a black belt in everything, but you need to be familiar with a lot of different situations. That's number one. Number 2 is complexity. All right? Given the effects of adrenaline, which is a reality of combat, and the fact that fine motor skills under adrenaline and pressure and time limitations can be, sorry, the effects of all these things can really affect our fine motor skills. Things that are really complicated or long can be very difficult to pull off. I'm not saying impossible, I'm saying difficult. Okay, so as a general rule, we want to stick to stuff which is simple, because it's going to be very hard to do complicated things when your brain is firing on all cylinders with adrenaline. Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3, and that's one of my favorites, and that's where I find a lot of traditional martial arts kind of fail in the self-defense context, is training with contact, anything from light contact to full contact, depending on the drill and what you do. Okay, but you have to train with contact. You have to train with resistance, and again, from little resistance to full resistance. And you have to train unpredictable responses. Okay? So, one more time, because this is really important. Contact, anything from light contact to full contact, depending on what you're doing, but you want to have experience in all 3. Resistance, from light resistance to no resistance, some resistance, full resistance, experience in all 3. And then unpredictable responses. Not always, I attack the guy in a particular way and he reacts in a particular way, because that's not how it happens. Okay, so we need to train contact, resistance, and unpredictable responses. If you're not doing that, you're not training for self-defense. Number 4, individuality. This is a big one and also complicated one. There are so many variables that go into a self-defense situation, that we talked about before. There's kind of like these 11 assumptions that we make, and that means that no 2 situations are going to be exactly the same. And we are all different, right? So I highlighted all these amazing instructors that I trained with before, in the first category. They all have different preferences. And that's exactly what individuality is all about, right? Based on, age, size, gender, preferences, our inclination to move forward or to back away, or previous injuries, previous trauma and experience, all those things affect what it is that we can and can't do and what we like and don't like to do. And I think that because of that, when we're training for self-defense, we can't always say, you have to do it like this is the right way. There is a set of principles that work, there's biomechanical principles that work, but to say, this is how you need to do it, might not necessarily work, right? So if you're a 6'4", 200-pound guy, you might be able to drop most people with, a good straight right, yeah. But if you are the same size as my wife, who's like 5'1" and weighs, like 47 kilos, guess what? Chances are she can hit people all day long, and it might not do as much. So we need to give people options, and we need to train for the individual, not for the system. There's an article that I wrote a little while ago about curriculums and how they affect self-defense training. There's a link at the bottom right about now. You can read it. So that's number 4. Number 5 is what I refer to as reverse engineering. And that's what I talked about in the previous video at the end. Reverse engineering, to quote Gershom and Karen, means that the problem dictates the solution, not the other way around. Okay, so what that means is we need to look at how violence happens and build our training around that. Not train and then say, oh, well, I think violence happens in this way, or modify it to suit how we like to train. Okay, so we need to find what the problem is and then find solutions, not say, well, I have this solution, let's modify the problem, because that is not going to work. So that was number 5, reverse engineering. Yep, we have to look at the problem, then find solutions, not the other way around. Number 6, the risk-return trade-off. Okay, so I am a finance lecturer by trade. I was a finance lecturer at university for like 10, 11 years, a long time. So one of the things that I really like to talk about in the context of self-defense, and this is something that applies, I guess, to most type of combat sports, but in self-defense, I think that the stakes are higher, is what I refer to as the risk-return trade-off. Right? So when we look at investment theory, the idea is that the greater the risk, right, the greater the potential return should be, right? To give you an example, if we look at, let's say, buying a lottery ticket, right, the risk, in other words, the chances that you're not going to win anything, the risk is very, very high, right? Most of the time you buy a lottery ticket, you don't win anything. But the potential return is huge, right? You spend, whatever it is to buy a lottery ticket, $10, $20, $30, whatever it is, but you have the potential to win a few million. So there's a high risk you're going to lose your money, but the potential return is very high, okay? The opposite of that would be taking all your money and putting it in the bank. You know the money is safe, so the risk is really low, but you're not going to make any money by keeping all your funds in a savings account, right? Using techniques in combat sport or self-defense in our context is kind of the same. So we want to use what Dr. Gav Schneider would refer to as forgiving techniques. In other words, one that are relatively low risk. So what do I mean by that? If doing something has a high chance of putting you in a bad position if it doesn't work, then you should probably try doing something else. For example, you may have really nice jumping spinning kicks, right? If you hit him, the guy goes to sleep. But the chance of pulling that off in real conditions where you're wearing uncomfortable clothing, the ground is slippery, you've been caught unaware, maybe you've had a couple of drinks, whatever it is, the chances of you actually pulling it off are really slim. The risk is that if I miss that, there's so many things that can go wrong because I'm in the air, I'm off balance, I'm turning my back as I'm spinning. There's a good chance I'm going to land on my butt if I miss that, right? So in terms of a risk-return trade-off, that is not a great technique, okay? So if I miss it, I put myself in a worse off position than I started. The flip side of that is even if something has a high chance of working, right, but doesn't improve your position or buy you time, you should probably do something else. Okay, so in other words, we want to use forgiving techniques, which are techniques that if we screw them up, they won't put us at a huge disadvantage. We also want to make sure that we adhere to, and this is principle 7, Rory Miller refers to this as the golden rule of combat. Richard Dimitri and name kind of escaped me, referred to this as closest weapon, closest target principle. We usually modify it to closest weapon, closest target, best result. I'm going to quote Rory Miller on this because I really like the way that he says it, and that is, your most powerful weapon applied to your opponent's greatest vulnerability at their time of maximum imbalance. Okay, so if we connect that to the risk-return trade-off, it kind of highlights what techniques might be available to us. But remember, these are all based on opportunity. So you don't go looking for something, you have to react to what's going on in front of you. Combat is dynamic. Okay, so we've got these kind of 7 assumptions or 7 ways of training when we're looking at self-defense, and these are based on the 11 assumptions we talked about before. Okay, so we need to have competency or experience fighting in a range, different ranges of fighting and different skill sets, so grappling, striking, weapons, clinch, ground. We need to try and avoid things that are overly complicated or very technical. We want to train with contact, with resistance, and with unpredictable responses. We need to adapt what we learn to suit our body and abilities. We need to look at the solution and then find a problem and not the other way around. We need to look at forgiving techniques and consider the risk-return trade-off in terms of what we do. And we want to generally go by the golden rule of combat or closest weapon, nearest target, best result, to make sure that we do the most efficient things that we can in order to achieve our goal, which is usually going to be, to do enough damage to get home safe. All right, so fight until the other person is unable or unwilling to continue fighting, again, to quote Gershom Ben Karen. Consider these things, see if they're relevant to what you think. Shoot me any questions. Stay safe.